Welcome back to Proxhammer, everybody. And today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different from the usual. We're actually going to be looking at some tournament results. I usually don't like looking at tournament results on my channel just because I'd rather be more helpful to the wider group of players that maybe isn't so competitive or doesn't really care about the tournament results. But I actually thought that this tournament indicated something very interesting about the way Craftworld Eldar plays, and honestly reveals a big problem in 40K as a whole that I think needs to be addressed with the next balance changes. So today we're going to be unpacking the Warhammer 40K 2022 SoCal Open, and we're going to be looking at what the results mean for the Craftworld Eldar and the game as a whole. So quick overview of the video. We're first going to be looking at what the SoCal Open actually is. We're going to be looking at the results briefly, and we're going to be looking at what the results mean for the Craftworld Eldar specifically. And I'm also going to be making a call to action and a proposed change that I think will help the game for the better. So to start things off, what is the SoCal Open exactly? So it's a massive 3-day event that was actually held on October 21st to 23rd this year. And there's numerous miniature events held here, including Warhammer 40K tournaments, but not limited. I think there's some Star Wars events and other things as well. And it is probably one of the biggest annual 40K events in California, and it typically has a massive turnout. And of course, one of these tournaments happened to be a competitive 40K match play tournament using the Nephilim rule set. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the results were. So a special thanks to one of my subscribers for pointing this out to me, Nick the Noodle. I'm not somebody who typically looks at tournament results a whole lot. Occasionally I'll look at them once in a while to see kind of in general where Eldar stand and where they may need some improvements, or, you know, where they may be strong in, or areas they may be strong in, I should say. So looking at this, there's a lot of numbers on this screen, but as you can tell, you can probably notice that there are a few trends. So the factions we knew were going to be strong coming into this: Harlequins, Chaos Demons, Necrons, Tyranids, and Sisters of Battle, Adeptus Sororitas, are all in the top numbers. So we have, Harlequins in second. And again, Forces of the Hive Mind probably really doesn't have enough games to be considered here. So Harlequins probably scored close to the highest for having the most games played. Chaos Demons came in next, then Necrons, Tyranids. Weirdly, Adeptus Custodes were in the top 5 this time, and then of course we have Sisters of Battle. So after that, we kind of have a mix of all the other factions. However, if you go down, you'll notice that Craftworld's is second to last. So although the numbers aren't very much different from their Drukhari cousins, who are just right above them, and of course the Leagues of Votann being in absolute last, and the reason for this, I believe, is because the Leagues of Votann secondaries are so bad, which we'll also get into. But essentially, this indicates, in a loose way, even though this is just one event, that Craftworlds are not doing so well in the competitive scene, and that is probably due to the fact that they can't really score a lot of victory points in their games. So if you look at the victory point comparison to something like Necrons, where you have them scoring an average of 72 victory points per game, and remember, 72 victory points per game out of 90 on average. So even factions that lost heavily didn't alter the victory point difference by too much. So let's say that a Necron player got sweeped. He didn't get sweeped bad enough to upset this number dramatically. Whereas Craftworlds, on the other hand, I think have a much harder time with this. And in fact, I would wager that some Craftworld players in this event really got manhandled in the way of victory points. So if you look at their average victory points scored, it's 60 per game, and their opponents was 65, which isn't that big of a difference. If you look at it just on a one-game basis, a 65 to 60-point game is a pretty close game, to be honest, right? But if you compare that with the averages of the other factions, it becomes quite clear that the top factions are really just scoring way too many points. So if you look at Chaos Demons, for example, their average victory points was 66 to the enemy's 59. That's almost a 7-point difference. If you look at Harlequins, for example, it's almost a 10-point difference. And Necrons, of course, if you look at them, it's about a 6 to 6.5 difference there as well. So as you get higher and higher, In the rankings, the victory points difference also is increased as you go higher, which makes a little bit of sense, right? Because those factions do have better secondaries. But I think what this mainly shows is that Craftworld Eldar and basically all other factions that rank below the top factions are struggling with their secondary point scoring. So they may be having close games with their opponents, but they're not actually able to bring home the win because, to be honest with you, a lot of their secondaries are just really hard to score on at this level of play. So let's go ahead and dive into why that might be. So what does this mean for the Craftworld Eldar? So I think even though this was only a single event, the win percentage is close enough to the global number that it kind of matches up. And if you remember the last data slate GW put out, Craftworld Eldar's tournament wins at about 46% globally. I think that 44% is pretty close to actually kind of confirm that they're probably around that power level. And I think there's a couple different reasons for this. And one of the reasons is that currently Craftworld Eldar have a bit of a victory point struggle against several dominant armies, including, again, Sisters of Battle, Necrons, and Tyranids, all of which score much higher in secondary objectives and can hold primary objectives much better. Now, here's the thing about this, is that I actually don't think the primary objective issue is the main concern with this. It doesn't really concern me all that much because that's just the nature of squishy factions in general. We have a lot of trouble holding ground, but we're fast enough and do enough damage to ensure that enemies can't easily score on their own primary objectives. So we can basically take out enemies that are trying to take and hold positions. Because we deal so much damage, we're able to sweep them off of those positions. But what is concerning to me is the ease at which the top factions can max secondaries with almost no interaction. So the Eldar struggle to max secondary objectives because not only do our secondary objectives typically score less points, but they're harder to achieve. Things like Behind Enemy Lines, Wrath of Cain, The Hidden Path. Things like that are typically the objectives we would take are a little bit harder to score on and don't score really enough points. And they definitely don't score consistently enough in every single game to make them auto-include. So even Scout the Enemy, which is typically considered one of the more auto-include secondary objectives for Craftworld Eldar, is still a little bit tricky to pull off against certain armies, and it won't always get you the max number of points. Now, I can typically, in a kind of semi-competitive game, get about 12 points with Scout the Enemy on average, right? But even so, when comparing that to Necrons, Sisters of Battle, Tyranids, and Chaos Demons, oftentimes those factions are going to be maxing out their secondary points at the full 45, getting 15 in each objective. And honestly, sometimes not the full 15 because, again, dice rolls do come into play, matchups do come into play. There may be some boards that are less favorable to some objectives and so forth. But in general, they can basically almost max out their points. Whereas with Craftworld Eldar, even in an ideal situation, you're not really going to be looking at 45 victory points scored. You're probably looking at closer to 40 or maybe even in the high 30s of victory points scored on secondary objectives. So unless you're going against a faction like Leagues of Votann, where the matchup is just so incredibly good for you that you can easily score on those objectives throughout the game and max out your points, you're going to struggle to max out those victory points on your secondaries. And just to press the point home that the secondary objectives are really the problem with the current tournament meta, look at the Leagues of Votann. The Leagues of Votann have a fantastic roster of units. However, their secondary objectives are just, to be honest with you, they're just awful. They punish you. They're heavily punishing. Unless you get ahead early in the game, you're really not going to be scoring a lot of secondary points. And I think a similar case is with the Craftworlds, to a lesser degree, of course, than Leagues of Votann, but still pretty significant, right? If you fall behind as a Craftworld Eldar player, not only are you falling behind in damage dealt, but you're also going to be falling behind in victory points, which is pretty much the most important thing, because if you look at the top factions of 40K right now, even if they fall behind in points, they're going to be ahead in victory points. So to kind of press this point home a little bit, for example, if you are playing a game in round one of a tournament and you are Craftworld Eldar and you destroy your opponent, but you don't quite score as high on secondaries, and maybe they don't either, right? But even so, because you didn't score that high amount of points, the Necron player at the next table over from you may have scored 86 points on objectives and been tabled on turn 5, right? And on the other hand, you may have won your game, but it doesn't matter because the winner of the tournament is usually based on the total amount of victory points scored. So that Necron player is already going to be way up in the pairings and way up in the rankings of the tournament than you do, even though you performed better in your game than they did models-wise or points-wise, right? So this can be a big problem for a lot of armies out there in 40K. So here's my call to action and proposed change. So I really think GW missed the mark with the last balance data slate in regards to the most oppressive secondary objectives, which were basically completely untouched. If you look at the objectives of, say, Necrons, for example. Now, Necrons have an old codex. A lot of their units are a little bit out of date, but yet their secondaries are so strong that they're one of the top factions, right? So again, I think GW really missed the mark on nerfing these most powerful secondaries that the top armies have access to. Meanwhile, the struggling factions did not get any real buffs to their secondary objectives, so even the Space Marine secondary buff hasn't really helped them be competitive in 40K tournaments. And in fact, no real faction, even if they were struggling on secondary objectives, got a buff to their secondary objective points. And even the most, again, struggling factions like Adeptus Mechanicus didn't really get any buffs to their secondary objectives either, even though they were one of the worst factions in tournament play in 40K. So in GW's effort to not change the meta too much, they actually failed to address the main problem with a lot of the balance issues in the game right now, which revolves around the ease in which it is to score on secondary objectives for some factions. So here's the thing, I really don't think having hard to score on secondary objectives is a problem for the game. I actually think this is how it should be, right? Eldar having a hard time to score on secondary objectives is okay. But if that's the case, you have to make it the same for the other factions as well. I think the main problem with the tournament scene at the moment is that there's objectives that are way too easy to score on and barely have anything to do with strategy or planning. So, for example, with Necrons, all they really have to do to score a lot of points early in the game is walk up to objectives and just perform their actions. And they're uninterruptible actions, and all of their units have objectives secured pretty much. And that's pretty much the epitome of Necron competitive play right now. So that's very uninteractive. There's not a lot you can do about it, and there's not a lot you can do to stop it if they get first turn. It's just kind of, well, you're going to be ahead, and you're going to stay ahead. Now, if they don't get first turn, there are a few things you can do to interfere with them, but again, they could always just destroy your models. There are a couple of ways we could use, for example, for Craftworld Eldar, we could use Vipers, or we could use other fast-moving units to come in, destroy their unit before it gets a chance to get on the objective, and prevent them from doing it that way. But again, that's a 50-50, whether or not you get first turn. So I think that in general, instead of buffing the factions that have poor secondary choices, I think to make a more balanced game and to understand what's really overpowered and what is not overpowered, I think you really have to tone down the secondaries from the top factions of the game. So factions like Necrons, Sisters of Battle, Chaos Demons, and Tyranids really need to take a hard look at their secondaries and tone them down so that they're a little less oppressive and they're a little more interactive to play with, right? There are things you can do to cancel those out and to counter them in the game, right? So I think GW really needs to focus on that. They need to focus on secondary objective play. They need to look at what kind of secondary objectives are non-interactive and change them so that they either score less points on those easy to get objectives, or you simply make the objectives harder to score on, right? So either one of those two things I think would go a long way towards balancing the tournament scene and the competitive scene of Warhammer 40K. Or here's my other suggestion, and I think this would help the game in a lot of ways as well. Give armies that get tabled or have less points or power level left on the board a penalty to their total victory points. So for example, that Necron army I told you about, if it gets tabled on turn 4, then they score less victory points in total. They have maybe minus 10 victory points taken away from their total score. And a fair number for this could be 5 victory points, for having less power level or points left on the board at the end of the game, and minus 10 points for getting tabled. That way, the Necron player can still score a lot of objective points and things like that, but at the end of the day, if they are tabled, they're going to have to suffer some sort of penalty for that, right? Because as things stand, there is no penalty for getting tabled. A player can get completely wiped off the board and still win the game at turn 5 if they have more victory points. So I think that's something that's a little odd about the game currently, and that I think should be changed. And I think that players who are obviously, not doing as well in certain areas of the game, for example, keeping their units alive or simply, killing more enemy units, need to be penalized a little bit at the end of the day, right? So I think that could also help. And not just Eldar, by the way, but I think a lot of factions that are more damage-based would benefit a lot from a change like this. And I think what you would see is a lot of the lower tier factions that are, 40% or 45% or below in the tournament rankings raise up to at least 46, 47%, and you'd see a much better outcome from those factions. So in conclusion, despite the tournament results, I still strongly believe the Craftworld Eldar are in a strong position rule-wise. However, the factions ruling the meta at the moment have way too much secondary objective power to catch up in points when played at the highest levels. And once again, there are some situations in competitive play where if you don't get first turn and the enemy gets on the objectives first, there's really not a lot of ways that you can stop them from scoring on secondary objectives. Now, of course, there are many ways that Eldar can get an opponent off a primary objective to score on the take and hold objective, because that gives us a turn to work with, right? We can go and we can use a coordinated strike to take whatever is on the objective out of play so that they can't score on that primary objective. But there's just so many secondary objectives that they can score on that the points is just too much if they get the chance to take 3 objectives or 4 objectives on turn 1, which again, in a lot of cases, Necron players can do this. And while we may be able to take out Necrons on 1 or 2 objectives, we're not going to be able to take them out on all of them. And that's where they're going to score most of their points, is on whatever we can't take out. And meanwhile, while they're maxing their secondary points, unfortunately, Craftworld Eldar have a much harder time maxing out our secondaries, because most of our secondaries either are very hard to get or they cap out at 12 points. So things like Warp Ritual, which is an easier one for us to get, caps out at 12 points, which is a little bit unfortunate. So in my opinion, GW really needs to tone down those easy secondary objectives so that they match the effort level it takes to score on them. And all the tournament and competitive talk aside, I'm really not a super competitive player, right? I mean, I participate in tournaments from time to time. I really like playing. I play with a competitive gaming group, some of whom actually did participate in the SoCal Open. I just happened to not this time around. But, all that competitive talk aside, I really do think that Eldar are a strong faction and have the core abilities and synergies required to be a top-tier faction. And honestly, they're a load of fun. Craftworld Eldar is honestly one of the only armies I've ever truly enjoyed playing in this game of 40K. I've played other armies, by the way. I've played Tau a little bit. I played Imperial Guard. I've played Dark Eldar. And even though I probably like Dark Eldar the second best, Eldar from the Craftworlds has always been my favorite go-to faction in all editions since I've started playing. And having said that, I've seen Eldar at their weakest, and I definitely don't think they're at their weakest. I think they just need a slight boost in a couple of different ways. There were some editions, by the way, guys, where Eldar were completely out of the picture as far as the competitive scene. And I'm talking about nearly every single tournament. Eldar was either not even present at the tournament, or if they were present, they were being tabled almost every game. I mean, this is back in the day, of course, but I think as far as balance, 40K balance goes, we're in a lot better spot than we were back then. But I still think the game needs some changes, especially in those, uninteractable situations where you really can't do anything against an opponent and you have almost no chance to win. Those are the situations which I feel like GW needs to work on. And in that regard, the problem lies squarely with secondary objectives, which I'm sure a lot of competitive players out there who frequently participate in tournaments would also more than agree with. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. We have some videos coming out this week on hobbying. I have a hobbying video that's coming out on how to get the most out of your Eldar army from a hobbyist's perspective and a fun perspective. We're going to be doing a video on that later this week. We're also going to be looking at a couple of different synergies between aspect warriors and a couple of other things I have planned as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. I'll see you later. Have a good one, everybody. And like always, leave a comment in the comment section about what you guys think about the current place that Craftworld Eldar finds themselves in the competitive scene. Have a good one.